January 18, 1943, Camp Toccoa, Georgia. The sky was clear, the wind calm, the kind of morning every instructor called perfect for a jump. 43 paratroopers stood on the airfield, their boots sinking slightly into the frosted grass as they adjusted the straps of their T5 parachutes. They had trained for months for this moment: climb, jump, count, pull, land. Routine. Nothing in the crisp air hinted that 5 of them would never touch the ground alive. At 09:12, the first C-47 Dakota lifted off its engines, droning across the training field. On-board young men sat silent, helmets pressed against knees, hands gripping the ripcord handles. From the ground, instructors watched the plane rise to 1,500 feet. The signal light blinked green. One by one, the jumpers stepped into the slipstream bodies, spinning briefly before stabilizing in perfect freefall. Then something went wrong. The first parachute deployed late, twisting violently as the canopy collapsed on itself. The second soldier's chute bloomed halfway and then folded, sending him spiraling downward. The third never opened at all. Within 20 seconds, 5 soldiers hit the ground, their bodies motionless among the scattered nylon. The silence that followed was heavier than the thud of impact. Training officers ran toward the landing zone, shouting for medics, but there was nothing to save. Witnesses would later say it looked like the parachutes had betrayed them, as if the very fabric designed to save lives had chosen that morning to turn against its owners. The official Army report listed the causes as possible material fatigue or improper packing, but neither explanation satisfied the men who packed those chutes every day. The same batch had passed all inspections. All had come from a respected supplier, the Irving Air Chute Company in Buffalo, New York. Within 3 weeks, 2 more accidents occurred, one in Alabama, another in North Carolina. In both, witnesses described the same sequence: parachutes that failed to bloom or spun uncontrollably before collapsing. In March, the Quartermaster General's office quietly initiated an internal investigation. What they found was alarming. Across U.S. training bases, more than 120 parachute malfunctions had been reported between late 1942 and spring 1943. 18 men were dead. 37 were permanently disabled. Behind closed doors, officers debated whether to halt airborne training entirely. But the war would not wait. In North Africa and Europe, American forces were preparing for airborne assaults that would require thousands of trained paratroopers. The factories had to keep producing, the soldiers had to keep jumping, and the Army needed answers fast. The press never heard about the accidents. Newspapers printed stories about heroism, not malfunction. Yet inside the parachute industry, rumors spread fast. Workers whispered about bad fabric, faulty thread, or sabotage. Inspectors found nothing conclusive. Every test parachute opened flawlessly when pulled by machine. The failures seemed random, untraceable ghosts in the seams. At the Irving plant, the production floor smelled of oil canvas and tension. Rows of women sat behind heavy Singer sewing machines, guiding shimmering nylon panels under metal needles. They were told their work decided whether men lived or died, but they had no idea why some parachutes seemed cursed. Among them was a 24-year-old seamstress named Evelyn Moore. On the day the Toccoa accident report arrived at the factory, she was stitching the same model that had failed in Georgia. She paused for a moment, looked at the pattern sheet pinned to her station, and wondered if the error wasn't in the fabric or the cord, but in the way the seams met. For the Army engineers, that thought never crossed their minds. To them, the problem had to be mechanical, weak nylon, poor packing, humidity, anything but human patterning. But for the people who touched every inch of fabric, who felt its tension under their fingers, the parachute was not just a design. It was alive, responsive, temperamental. Every line mattered. Every stitch carried weight. In one archived interview years later, a test officer from Wright Field recalled how baffling the crisis had been. We'd pull one chute, it opened perfectly. The next identical model failed completely. The math didn't add up. We assumed it was random error. It wasn't. The Army never released those early reports, but factory memos recovered decades later reveal that by mid-1943, the parachute division faced what insiders called the invisible failure. Statistical models predicted that 1 in every 300 parachutes could fail under load even when passing inspection. 1 in 300 may not sound catastrophic until you realize that for every major airborne operation, thousands would jump. The numbers meant death was baked into the system, and yet, buried in those same records is a brief note dated May 1943, observation by operator E. Moore, possible stitching sequence defect under review. It would be months before anyone paid attention to it, but that note marked the beginning of the end for America's parachute crisis. Because while engineers studied diagrams and formulas, one woman was watching how fabric moved, twisted, and pulled beneath her hands. She could see what they couldn't. Sometimes history doesn't turn in laboratories or command rooms. Sometimes it changes in the hum of a sewing machine under the dim light of a factory floor when someone dares to ask why. If you believe even a single stitch can decide between life and death, type 1 in the comments. If you think it's just coincidence, hit like. And don't forget to subscribe, because in the next chapter, you'll learn how a seamstress with no engineering degree would challenge the entire U.S. Army's production system and win. By the spring of 1943, the United States was producing parachutes the same way it was producing bullets, by the millions fast and under unimaginable pressure. The Quartermaster Corps had set a target that seemed impossible, even to its own engineers, 250,000 parachutes per month, enough to supply every division training at home and every airborne unit fighting overseas. To meet that goal, the War Department expanded contracts to dozens of civilian companies, Irving Air Chute in New York, Switlick in Trenton Pioneer in Massachusetts, and more than 100 smaller factories scattered across the Midwest. Each plant operated like a city unto itself. Women made up nearly 80% of the workforce. They arrived at dawn, hair tied back in scarves, sewing machines humming in endless rows. Every seam had to be perfect, every stitch uniform, every panel numbered. Supervisors walked the aisles with clipboards measuring timing, calculating. A complete T5 parachute required more than 4,000 stitches, 43 yards of nylon, and 68 feet of suspension line. Workers were told to finish one every 40 minutes. Speed was everything. Precision came second. Posters on factory walls read, "Every second counts, every stitch saves a life." But the truth beneath the slogan was harsher. Every shortcut risked one. In factories where the roar of machines never stopped, fatigue set in quickly. Mistakes crept in unnoticed. Nylon panels were sometimes cut a fraction off, pattern lines twisted before stitching, thread tension uneven from machine to machine. None of these tiny errors seemed serious until a parachute twisted itself shut 2,000 feet above the ground. In March, a confidential memo from the Army Air Forces warned of a disturbing trend. Incidents of line entanglement and canopy inversion appear statistically excessive across multiple production lots. The engineers called it a deployment instability anomaly. The soldiers had a simpler term, death bloom. Investigators swarmed the manufacturing plants, checking every possible variable. They blamed humidity. They blamed packing errors. They even blamed sabotage. At one point, the FBI sent agents to interview workers suspected of disloyal sentiment. No evidence was ever found. Still, the accidents continued. In one chilling week in April, 5 men died during training jumps in different states, all using parachutes from separate factories. Each chute bore the same Army specification code, T5. It was the model used in every airborne operation from Sicily to Normandy. The mathematics were merciless. A single division might make 10,000 practice jumps in a month. Even a 1% failure rate meant 100 men would die before ever seeing combat. And the numbers were worse than that. Reports suggested some lots had failure rates approaching 3%. Inside the Pentagon, generals argued over whether to slow production. Some said halting even for a week could cripple the upcoming European invasion. Others warned that continuing meant sending men to die in training. A compromise was reached. Keep the lines running, but order enhanced quality control. That phrase, enhanced quality control, translated to one thing on the factory floor: more pressure. Supervisors demanded double inspections, but without adding extra time. Workers now had to produce faster, while also being more careful. The result was chaos, wrapped in discipline. In a plant in New Jersey, Evelyn Moore watched it unfold every night. The floor was a sea of khaki and nylon, the clatter of needle against fabric constant. Supervisors called out production numbers through megaphones. The women competed for bonuses tied to output. Parachutes rolled down the line like loaves of bread. Evelyn's section handled the assembly of the main canopy, 28 panels of ripstop nylon, each joined at a narrow angle, forming the circular dome that would bloom above a soldier's head. It was there, between the hiss of the steam irons and the whine of the sewing machines, that she began noticing something no engineer had written about. Some parachutes, even when carefully packed, developed a subtle torque along the central seam. When the canopy opened, that torque translated into a spiral motion, a twist that could lock the risers together and collapse the chute. At first, Evelyn thought it was just her imagination, but the pattern was too consistent. The problem always appeared in chutes sewn from the outer panels inward, the way the blueprints required. When she experimented starting instead from the center seam and working outward, the fabric lay flat, smooth, relaxed. It was a difference you could feel with your hands, not measure with a ruler. Still, the official diagrams were sacred. The Army engineers who wrote them were untouchable, and factory workers weren't supposed to think about aerodynamics. Evelyn mentioned her observation once to a supervisor, a man named Harris, who had spent his career selling typewriters before the war. He smiled politely, said, "That's above our pay grade," and told her to focus on meeting quota. But the numbers kept haunting her. The factory log listed 7 parachutes returned for deployment irregularity in 1 week, all sewn on her line, all from panel stitched edge to center. In May 1943, a new order came down. Production of T5 models would double. A poster appeared near the cafeteria entrance: "Every hour counts, our boys are waiting." The slogan made Evelyn uneasy. Somewhere overseas, men were waiting for parachutes she no longer trusted. The tragedy wasn't abstract anymore. She had started recognizing serial numbers from the chutes in accident reports pinned on the factory notice board. One morning she saw a number she had sewn herself. The report beside it read, "Fatal. Canopy twisted upon deployment." That was the day Evelyn stopped believing this was random. The same week, she began staying after her shift stitching test panels in secret. She used scrap nylon from the floor and old thread left by the maintenance crew. She wasn't trying to defy orders, only to understand why. What she would discover in the following months would overturn the entire understanding of parachute safety and expose a hidden flaw no engineer had ever documented. But before she could prove anything, she would have to survive a system that valued output over lives. If you believe production pressure can blind even the smartest engineers, type 1 in the comments. If you think discipline and obedience are what win wars, hit like. And don't forget to subscribe, because in the next part, you'll see how a factory worker with a sewing machine challenged military science itself. The war had a way of swallowing names. On the payroll sheets of the Irving Airchute Company, E. Moore was just one of more than 3,000 women listed under Machine Operator Canopy Division. She wasn't an engineer, not a manager, not even a senior supervisor. Yet night after night, as the floor thundered with the rhythm of sewing machines, she saw patterns no engineer could ever feel. Evelyn Moore was 24 years old, a tailor's daughter from Newark, who had once made wedding dresses before the war took the men and the silk away. When the Army called for essential war workers, she traded satin for nylon and the hum of a boutique for the roar of industrial production. She didn't talk much. Her co-workers said she was the kind who noticed small things: the angle of a needle, the way fabric puckered, Under tension, the sound a machine made before the thread snapped. By 1943, she could sew a T5 canopy blindfolded. Each parachute was a puzzle of 28 gores stitched together in perfect symmetry. The Army's pattern diagrams showed every line, every overlap, every reinforcement. But they didn't show what happened when the fabric moved. Nylon, unlike silk, had a life of its own. It stretched, when warm contracted, when cool twisted slightly, when under tension. The engineers who designed the pattern worked with equations. Evelyn worked with her fingertips, and her fingertips told her something was wrong. During quality checks, she noticed that canopies sewn in the standard sequence from outer panels inward always developed a slight torque near the center seam. The outer panels already joined pulled against the fresh inner seam, locking tension into the dome like a spring waiting to release. When the canopy opened at high speed, that tension had only one way to escape, by twisting the parachute lines. She tried mentioning it once during a break to her line foreman Harris. He laughed. "You're seeing ghosts more. The Army drew the pattern. We just follow it." But Evelyn couldn't let it go. She began saving scraps from discarded panels, cutting miniature versions of the canopies. She stitched them by hand at her boarding house, experimenting with different sequences. One night she pinned 2 models side by side on her kitchen table, each only 12 inches across. She hung them by strings from the ceiling fan, turned it on low, and watched as one twisted violently while the other spun open and stayed steady. The difference was obvious. The one sewn from the center outward lay perfectly balanced. It wasn't a scientific experiment, but it was enough to make her certain. The next night she decided to try it on a real parachute. She stayed late after her shift, when most of the floor lights were off and the supervisors had gone home. Using leftover nylon marked for disposal, she built her first full-size test canopy. It took 6 hours. She followed her own rule: start from the center seam, work outward, alternating sides to keep tension even. By sunrise, the dome hung from the rafters, smooth as glass. She wrote 3 letters on the label with a pencil stub, EM1. A week later, she made 2 more labeled EM2 and EM3. To anyone else, they looked like standard parachutes. But inside their seams lay a quiet rebellion against the U.S. Army's engineering department. When she showed her work to Harris, the foreman barely glanced at it. "You changed the sequence," he said, frowning. "You can't do that. Those are Army specs. Do you want to get us shut down?" "I just want to test it," Evelyn replied. "You're not an engineer," he said, shaking his head. "We don't test ideas here. We make what they tell us." She knew he was right on paper, but she also knew men were dying, and she could no longer pretend it wasn't connected to the seams she'd been sewing. So she made a deal with one of the test rig operators, a quiet man named Charlie Donnelly, who sometimes inspected the canopies before shipment. She asked him to substitute one of her samples into the next test batch without telling anyone. A week later, Charlie found her in the cafeteria, eyes wide. "You won't believe this," he whispered. "We ran 12 test drops, 10 regular chutes twisted. Yours opened clean every time." Evelyn felt her heart race. "Did you tell them?" He hesitated. "I tried. They said it was coincidence. The sample probably had better material." Coincidence. That was the word that haunted her. Every failed parachute, every dead paratrooper written off as coincidence. She decided to go further. Over the next month, she kept a hidden notebook: dates, serial numbers line, tension readings, deployment results. The data told a story too precise to ignore. Standard chutes showed an average canopy rotation of 12 degrees under deployment. Her sequence averaged less than 3. The difference was measurable, quantifiable, real. But facts alone weren't enough. In a system built on hierarchy, proof from a seamstress meant nothing. In August 1943, she requested a meeting with the plant's quality supervisor, Mr. Kinsley, a gray-haired engineer with 30 years of experience. She waited outside his office for 2 hours before he called her in. He barely looked up from his desk. "What's this about?" Evelyn placed her notebook on the table. "Sir, I think we're sewing them wrong." He raised an eyebrow. "Wrong? We've made 200,000 of them this year? Yes, sir, she said softly, and some of them are killing men. That sentence hung in the air longer than she expected. Kinsley leafed through her notes, expression unreadable. You're saying the sewing order is the cause. I can show you. The fabric twists when you pull it from the outside first. It stores stress. It's like winding a spring. He sighed. Miss Moore, we've had a dozen investigations already. If this were real, someone would have found it. They didn't sew it, she said quietly. He looked at her, then really looked at her. Finally, he closed the notebook and said, I'll think about it. It wasn't approval, but it wasn't dismissal either. And for the first time, Evelyn felt the smallest crack in the wall of indifference that surrounded her. What she didn't know was that her quiet defiance would soon reach the desks of Washington, force the Army to re-examine its most trusted designs, and rewrite how parachutes were built for the rest of the war. But before that could happen, she would pay a price for breaking the chain of command. If you've ever had an idea, no one believed type 1 in the comments. If you think rules exist for a reason, hit like. And subscribe because in the next part, you'll see what happened when a seamstress challenged the U.S. Army and they tried to silence her. By November 1943, the tension inside the Irving Air Chute factory was almost physical. The walls themselves seemed to hum with the pressure of production. Posters reminded the women, faster means victory. Loudspeakers blared patriotic songs between shifts. But beneath the rhythm of needles and the roar of air compressors, another current was running quiet, invisible, and dangerous. Evelyn Moore had crossed an invisible line. Her unauthorized parachutes, EM1 through EM3, were no longer secrets. A test inspector had mentioned the flawless deployments to his supervisor, and within days, the rumors reached the foreman's office. One morning, Evelyn was summoned to the conference room, a narrow space lined with glass windows overlooking the factory floor. 3 men were waiting for her, Harris, the line foreman, Mr. Kinsley, the quality supervisor, and a representative from the Army's Quartermaster Corps, his uniform pressed to perfection. Harris began without preamble. Miss Moore, did you alter production specifications without authorization? Evelyn glanced at the 3 parachutes folded neatly on the table. She could see her handwriting EM still faint on the labels. Yes, sir, but I... That's enough, Harris interrupted. Do you understand that altering a government pattern violates federal war regulations? That you could be dismissed, or worse? She swallowed hard. Sir, those changes saved lives, the tests showed. The quartermaster officer cut in, voice calm but firm. The tests showed nothing conclusive. You have no formal training, Miss Moore. We have procedures for a reason. Mr. Kinsley, silent until now, finally spoke. Gentlemen, her samples did perform better. That's a fact. Harris turned on him. Coincidence. Material variation. We've seen that before. Kinsley didn't back down, not with zero twist across multiple deployments. I've checked the log myself. The numbers don't lie. The officer frowned. Numbers can be interpreted. Regulations cannot. The production schedule must continue. We're already behind for December shipment. He gathered the parachutes, tucked them under his arm, and stood. The matter is closed. But the matter was far from closed. That night, Evelyn was told she was being suspended for procedural non-compliance. 2 days without pay. Her co-workers whispered about it in the cafeteria. Some admired her courage. Others thought she'd gone too far. You can't fight the Army, one woman said quietly. Evelyn didn't answer. She spent those 2 days at home staring at her notes, wondering if she had been wrong after all. When she returned to work, something had changed. The floor seemed colder, the lights harsher. Supervisors now checked every station twice. Yet the accidents kept happening. 2 more parachute failures were reported at training bases that same week, both from the same production lot her line had sewn using the official Army sequence. Mr. Kinsley called her into his office late that Friday. He looked tired eyes, shadowed by weeks of pressure. They won't admit it, he said quietly. But your method works. I ran tests myself, 10 sample standard pattern versus your sequence. The difference is measurable. Deployment torque drops by 70%. Evelyn exhaled slowly. Then why not change it? Because change slows production, and slowing production slows the war. He paused. But I'm not letting this go. I've requested an official field test. It was a small victory, but for Evelyn, it meant everything. On December 14, 1943, the Army arranged a limited demonstration at Wright Field, Ohio, the same air base that tested new parachute models. A C-47 Dakota would make a dozen test drops, half the chutes sewn under the standard sequence, half using Evelyn's. No one told her she would be there until the day before. When she arrived at the airfield, the sight stole her breath. The massive transport plane gleamed silver under the winter sun. Engineers, officers, and reporters moved about the tarmac. She felt out of place among them, a factory worker in a borrowed overcoat, her name stitched on a badge that simply read, Civilian Technician. The first test began at 10:00 a.m. The plane climbed to 3,000 feet. The drop mechanism released the chutes one by one, the first 3 standard models deployed with a visible wobble. One twisted hard before stabilizing. A few officers exchanged uneasy glances. Then came the first of Evelyn's. The canopy opened cleanly, perfect symmetry, no spin. The second followed again, flawless. By the 6th drop, even the skeptical observers were silent. A test engineer leaned toward the quartermaster officer and murmured, "She's right." After the final drop, the officer in charge turned to the crowd. "Gentlemen, I think we've just witnessed something remarkable." Kinsley clapped a hand on Evelyn's shoulder. "Congratulations," he said softly. "You just changed the way we build parachutes." But victory, even in science, doesn't come without resistance. When the official report reached Washington 2 weeks later, the conclusion read, "Improved deployment consistency achieved through revised manufacturing procedure, adjustment implemented under engineering section supervision." There was no mention of Evelyn Moore. Back at the factory, she received a letter on company stationery thanking her for valuable contributions to production refinement. No one outside those walls would ever know what she had done. Still, word spread quietly among the workers. They called her the girl who stopped the twist. Some even started sewing in her sequence before the new orders arrived, defying regulations to make sure no more men fell to their deaths. Evelyn didn't ask for recognition. She just wanted the numbers to change. And they did. By the end of 1944, parachute malfunction rates dropped from nearly 3% to less than 0.1%. Thousands of men jumped into Europe and the Pacific and lived. But the story of how it happened, of the woman who refused to look away from a deadly mistake, stayed hidden for decades. If you believe courage sometimes looks like breaking the rules, type 1 in the comments. If you think following orders is the only way to win a war, hit like. And don't forget to subscribe, because in the next part, you'll see how a single field test in Ohio triggered a revolution in how America built its parachutes and how one woman's defiance quietly saved thousands of lives. The morning of December 14, 1943 began like any other at Wright Field, Ohio. Gray clouds, thin frost on the hangar doors, the echo of engines being warmed for flight. But this day would be different. By noon, it would rewrite one of the most overlooked chapters in the engineering history of World War II. The C-47 Dakota sat at the edge of the runway, its twin Pratt & Whitney engines rumbling like restrained thunder. Behind it, a small crowd gathered Army engineers, quartermaster officers, factory representatives, and a handful of civilian technicians. Among them stood Evelyn Moore, her hands buried in her coat pockets, a thin scarf pulled tight against the winter wind. She was the only woman on the airfield and the only one not in uniform. Inside the hangar, 12 parachutes were laid out on long tables, each numbered and recorded. 6 were standard T5 models, sewn according to official specifications. The other 6 were the controversial ones, the EM series, stitched in secret at the factory and later approved for testing only after Kinsley insisted. Every canopy had been weighed, measured, and packed under identical conditions. The goal was simple: compare deployment performance under controlled drops. At 09:45, a ground officer briefed the observers. We'll drop 3 sets of chutes at 3,000 feet each set, containing 1 control and 1 modified. Wind is 5 knots out of the northwest. Visibility 10 miles. It was cold enough to bite through gloves. Evelyn could see her breath fog the air as she watched the first 2 chutes loaded into the aircraft. When the plane taxied down the runway and lifted into the pale sky, she felt her pulse climb with it. At 10:07, the first test began. 2 weighted dummy packs were released simultaneously. The standard chute opened first, but twisted almost immediately, spiraling slightly before stabilizing. The modified chute opened 3 seconds later, perfectly symmetrical. Observers recorded data with stopwatches and binoculars. One engineer noted minimal rotation, 0 oscillation. Evelyn said nothing. She simply watched the white domes drift downward, one wobbling like a drunken balloon, the other gliding smooth as silk. The second drop came 15 minutes later. Again the control chute twisted. Again the EM chute did not. By the third set, the difference was undeniable. Even the skeptical quartermaster officer from the factory, who had once threatened her with dismissal, stood silently taking notes. At 11:20, the pilot radioed down proceeding to altitude for live jump test. Everyone turned toward the transport. The final phase would involve an actual paratrooper, Staff Sergeant Harold Red Halverson, a veteran test jumper who had made more than 200 practice jumps. He volunteered for the demonstration after hearing about the mysterious woman's design. At 11:32, from 3,000 feet, Red stepped out of the aircraft. His chute opened cleanly, no spin, no flutter, perfect descent. When he landed, he jogged toward the observers, grinning. If they all opened like that, he said, I'd never be scared of the jump again. Then came the second live test, this time with the standard pattern. From the moment the canopy inflated, the difference was visible. The chute twisted on itself, cords tightening like rope. The sergeant spun nearly 90 degrees before regaining stability. When he landed, he threw his helmet to the ground. That's the one that kills you, he shouted. The test logs confirmed what every pair of eyes on that airfield had seen. Out of 12 drops, 5 of the standard chutes exhibited moderate to severe line twist. None of the EM models did. Measured canopy rotation, 12.4 degrees average for standard, 2.7 for modified. Deployment time reduced by nearly half a second, a lifetime difference at terminal velocity. The lead engineer from right field summarized it best. The modification eliminates rotational stress during line deployment. Probable cause redistribution of fabric tension through sequential stitching pattern. In layman's terms, she fixed it. Evelyn didn't smile. She simply exhaled for the first time in hours. For months she had been told she didn't understand, that she was just a seamstress. Now, in front of Army officers and professional engineers, her hands had proven smarter than their blueprints. After lunch, the officers gathered in a briefing room near the hangar. Kinsley presented the data on a chalkboard, lines of numbers and arrows showing stress vectors. The quartermaster representative, who once dismissed Evelyn, now stood to the side, expression unreadable. When the results were announced, the room stayed silent for several seconds before anyone spoke. This is definitive, said one of the senior engineers. We're implementing this immediately. Effective January 1st, all parachute assembly will follow the new sequence. Evelyn's eyes widened. You mean across all factories? Kinsley nodded. Every contract plant in the country. It was done. The ridiculous idea of a factory worker would now become Army regulation. But official recognition never followed. The Army's press office released a brief statement the following month. Production procedures revised to improve parachute performance. Implementation completed nationwide. No names. No mention of where the improvement came from. Still, on that December afternoon, standing by the runway with the wind whipping through her hair, Evelyn didn't think about credit. She thought about the men who would jump over France, over Holland, over the Pacific Islands, trusting that their parachutes would open. She thought about the 5 who had died at Camp Toccoa, and how maybe now no one else would fall that way again. Kinsley found her before she left. You know they'll never print your name in the report, he said. I know, she replied. I just want the numbers to change." And they did. Over the next year, the Army recorded a 97% reduction in canopy malfunctions. What had once been a fatal defect turned into a statistical anomaly. Engineers who reviewed the data decades later would call it one of the most effective quality control corrections of the entire war. That night, back in her boarding room, Evelyn took out her notebook and added one last entry test sequence confirmed. New pattern accepted. I can sleep now. If you believe that one small act of defiance can change the fate of thousands, type 1 in the comments. If you think miracles only happen in laboratories, hit like. And don't forget to subscribe, because in the next part, we'll see how Evelyn's quiet discovery spread through America's war industry, transforming not only parachute design, but the entire science of stress management in fabric and steel alike. By the start of 1944, a quiet transformation was spreading through America's war industry. No headlines announced it, no radio broadcasts praised it, and no medals were handed out. Yet within weeks, every parachute plant in the United States, from the sprawling Irving factory in New York to the smaller Switlick works in Trenton, received the same revised manual. A single line buried on page 17 changed everything: stitch sequence, center to edge, alternating panel sides to ensure tension balance. It looked like an ordinary technical adjustment, another small improvement in a sea of wartime directives. But for the engineers who understood what it meant, the implications were enormous. The instruction eliminated a systemic flaw that had silently killed men for more than a year. And it had come not from a laboratory or military research center, but from a woman with a sewing machine. The new process was deceptively simple. Instead of sewing each canopy panel from the outside inward, as the original T5 blueprints required, operators now began at the geometric center of the canopy, working outward in alternating sections. This method allowed heat and tension to dissipate evenly as the nylon cooled. It prevented the micro-torque that caused line twist under high-speed deployment. In mechanical terms, it converted stored potential stress into distributed strain, an elegant, almost poetic solution born of touch rather than theory. Within 2 months of implementation, malfunction rates dropped to levels that astonished even the most skeptical officers. Statistical summaries from the quartermaster's office showed canopy twist incidents reduced by 97.4% and total parachute failures nearly eliminated. Out of more than 180,000 operational jumps recorded between January and June 1944, only 19 reported partial deployments, most due to packing or ripcord errors, not design flaws. For the first time since the Army's airborne program began, confidence in the parachute was absolute. Behind the numbers lay a massive logistical undertaking. The War Production Board restructured entire assembly lines to accommodate the new stitching pattern. Training schools for industrial seamstresses introduced the center-out method as a national standard. Posters once reading "Every Stitch for Victory" were quietly replaced with new ones that said, "Balance builds safety." No one mentioned who had inspired the slogan. For Evelyn Moore, life at the Irving plant returned to something resembling normal. She was reinstated without ceremony, assigned to assist in the retraining of new recruits. Each morning, she stood beside rows of young women learning the same lesson she had once taught herself. Tension travels, and how you release it determines everything. She never mentioned her role in the discovery. Most of them assumed she was just another instructor, another pair of hands behind the war effort. That was exactly how she preferred it. Meanwhile, in Washington, technical officers compiled the official engineering report on the T5 revision. The authorship line listed 3 men: Lieutenant Caller, David Martin, Engineering Division; Robert Kinsley, Senior Quality Supervisor; and Captaris Harold Briggs, Materials Analysis Section. Buried in the appendix in small print was a single acknowledgement special thanks to Operator E. Moore for initial observations regarding stitch sequencing anomalies. It was the only time her name appeared in any government record. But the influence of her insight extended far beyond parachutes. Once engineers understood how localized stress from manufacturing sequences could accumulate in flexible materials, they began applying the principle to every corner of wartime production. Aircraft fabric coverings were redesigned with alternating seam orders to prevent flutter. Nylon webbing for cargo harnesses adopted tension-balancing cross-stitches. Even certain steel welding procedures were revisited, inspired by the same concept of residual stress relief that Evelyn had demonstrated in cloth. A 1945 research bulletin from the Army's Engineering Division described it in language that could have been lifted directly from her notebook. Any continuous fabrication process must account for cumulative strain introduced by sequential work patterns. Structural integrity depends as much on order of assembly as on material strength. The idea would later become a cornerstone of modern manufacturing science. But at the time, no one outside the military and industrial world noticed. The public saw only results paratroopers landing safely in Normandy, in Holland, in the Philippines. Newsreels showed waves of white canopies opening across the sky like a field of flowers. Reporters called it the choreography of victory. None mentioned that the choreography had once been chaos. In April 1944, an internal Army report estimated that the revised sewing sequence had already saved in excess of 1,200 lives based on projected failure rates from the previous year. By the end of the war, that number would exceed 8,000. 8,000 men who came home because one woman refused to ignore what she saw. The irony was that Evelyn never saw a single one of them. Her war remained confined to a factory floor, to the steady hum of machines and the faint scent of nylon dust. Her weapon was not a rifle or a bomb. It was precision persistence and the courage to question. When the war ended in 1945, the T-5 parachute was replaced by the improved T-7 designed directly from the principles proven by Evelyn's work. The T-7's deployment system became the basis for the next generation of airborne equipment used into the Korean War and beyond. Even decades later, NASA engineers designing early re-entry parachutes for space capsules cited the same balanced stress sequencing methods developed during World War II. History never told where it came from, but those who had been there, the engineers at Wright Field, the supervisors at Irving, and the jumpers who owed their lives to a canopy that opened without a twist, never forgot. If you believe that real revolutions often begin not with inventions, but with someone paying attention, type 1 in the comments. If you think change only comes from the top hit, like. And subscribe, because in the final part, we'll reveal what became of Evelyn after the war and how her forgotten discovery quietly shaped the technology that protects lives to this very day. When the war ended in 1945, the great machines fell silent. The roar of production lines that had once shaken entire cities gave way to the hush of peacetime. Shipyards emptied, aircraft hangars grew quiet. And in the small town of Newark, New Jersey, a woman named Evelyn Moore folded her work apron one last time and went home. There was no ceremony, no parade, no mention of her name in the newspapers. For the millions who celebrated victory, she was invisible, a ghost among the legions of anonymous women who had kept the factories alive while the men fought overseas. Her last paycheck was stamped with 2 words, contract complete. But in the logbooks of the quartermaster course, in the test archives at Wright Field, and in the engineering bulletins of 1944, her fingerprints remained thin pencil lines, neat handwriting, and data columns that had quietly rewritten how America understood safety. After the war, Evelyn returned to civilian life, renting a small room above a dress shop on Broad Street. She opened her own tailoring business, sewing wedding gowns and baby clothes, never mentioning the parachutes that had defined her life. To her customers, she was simply Mrs. Moore, the quiet seamstress, with steady hands and a kind smile. For nearly 20 years, she never spoke about what she had done. It wasn't until 1962 that her name resurfaced. A young Air Force historian named Lieutenant Robert Langley, researching a retrospective on wartime innovations, came across an obscure footnote in a 1944 engineering report. Operator E. Moore, originator of sequencing observation. Intrigued, he tracked down surviving factory records, cross-referencing them with employee rosters. What he found stunned him. There was no citation, no patent, no commendation, just a payroll number, a time card, and a sequence of memos confirming her role in identifying and testing the modification that had eliminated the Army's parachute failures. Langley tried to contact her through the Veterans Office, but his letters went unanswered. It wasn't until 1964, 2 decades after the Wright field tests, that he found her name again on the storefront of a small tailor shop in Newark. He drove there one afternoon, introduced himself, and explained why he had come. Evelyn listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap. When he finished, she said only, "I didn't do it for credit. I just didn't want any more boys to die." Langley later wrote in his notes, "She spoke of it like someone describing a minor repair, not a revolution." 2 years later, he published his research in a limited Air Force Review journal titled Unsung Engineers of the American Home Front. The article contained a brief paragraph about a seamstress who had identified a stitching sequence error that reduced parachute failures by 97%. Her name appeared once. No photograph accompanied it. But her story began to circulate quietly among military historians. By the 1970s, the principle Evelyn had discovered had spread far beyond parachutes. Aerospace manufacturers applied it to the design of high-tensile fabric used in ejection seats. Industrial engineers studying fatigue stress in materials cited her case as an early example of sequence-dependent integrity. The term eventually entered textbooks on materials science stripped of names, reduced to formulas, but her insight remained at its core. In 1983, NASA engineers revisiting parachute systems for the Space Shuttle program referenced the original Wright field documentation from 1943. One internal memo noted stress distribution technique derived from W2's parachute assembly correction, more E still valid under high-tensile synthetic composites. Even in space, her fingerprints remained. Evelyn never knew. She retired in 1985, her hand still steady, her eyesight fading. 2 years later, she died quietly in her sleep at the age of 68. Her obituary in the Newark Star-Ledger was 6 lines long. It mentioned only that she had worked in wartime industry and later owned a tailoring business. There was no mention of Wright Field, no mention of the thousands of lives her discovery had saved. But history has a way of finding its missing pieces. In 2003, the U.S. Army Quartermaster Museum in Fort Lee, Virginia, launched an exhibition titled Behind the Seams, The Women Who Built Victory. Among the documents displayed was a faded engineering diagram of the T-5 parachute, annotated in pencil, stitch sequence corrected per E. Moore, 1243. Visitors walked past without knowing who she was, but for those who looked closely, the initials said everything. Today, every modern parachute, every ejection system, every rescue canopy deployed over oceans or deserts carries within it the DNA of her discovery. The balanced stitch pattern she pioneered remains standard practice across military and civilian manufacturing worldwide. Engineers studying materials under load still teach the same rule Evelyn once learned by instinct. Start from the center, move outward, balance the stress before it breaks you. Her story is more than a tale of engineering. It's a reminder of how progress often begins not with brilliance or rank, but with attention, humility, and the courage to question what everyone else accepts as truth. In war, heroism usually wears medals. Hers wore thread. Somewhere above the clouds, in every canopy that opens without a twist, in every soldier who lands safely on foreign soil, her legacy still unfolds quietly, perfectly, like the seam that held the world together when it was falling apart. If you believe that history often forgets its quietest heroes, type 1 in the comments. If you think credit doesn't matter when lives are saved, hit like. And if you want more untold stories of ordinary people who changed the course of World War II, subscribe, because the next time we look up at the sky and see a parachute bloom, we'll remember the woman who made sure it always opened. August 1942. While Tokyo's war planners stared in disbelief at the ruins of their carrier fleet across the Pacific, the night sky above San Francisco Bay glowed orange from a different kind of fire, the fire of creation. From the marshes of a small town called Richmond, California, came the roar of furnaces and the flash of welding torches. The war had reached a turning point. Japan's admirals were counting losses at Midway, but in Richmond, thousands of Americans were learning to build victory from steel. Few outside the United States had ever heard of Richmond before the war. It was a small ship repair port, a handful of warehouses, a fishing dock, and a railroad spur that ended in a salt marsh. By 1941, it had fewer than 24,000 residents. Within a year, it would become the largest shipyard complex on Earth, producing more tonnage than the entire Imperial Japanese Navy could replace. The transformation was so fast that even the workers themselves could barely believe what they were doing. In December 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor shocked America into motion. The United States had entered a global war already raging across 2 oceans, yet its merchant fleet was too small and too slow to feed the armies that would soon be fighting in Africa, Europe, and the Pacific. German U-boats were sinking freighters faster than America could build them. Japan's navy ruled the Western Pacific. The lifelines of the free world were breaking link by link. President Franklin Roosevelt called for what he described as the arsenal of democracy. He wanted an economy that could produce tanks, aircraft, and ships in numbers no enemy could match. His goal was staggering 50,000 airplanes, 45,000 tanks, and 8 million tons of new shipping every year. Industrialists said it was impossible. One man refused to agree. His name was Henry J. Kaiser, a self-taught builder who had never built a ship in his life. Kaiser had spent the 1930s carving dams out of desert rock, including the colossal Hoover Dam. He understood how to organize tens of thousands of workers, how to turn chaos into rhythm. When the Maritime Commission asked for shipbuilders, Kaiser promised something that sounded insane. He would deliver cargo ships faster than anyone thought possible. "Give me workers," he said, "and I'll give you ships." The ship he would mass produce was the Liberty ship, a 441-foot steel freighter weighing over 10,000 tons, designed to carry everything from tanks and ammunition to wheat and medicine. It was not a beautiful vessel. Engineers called it ugly but useful. But Kaiser saw something else, a product that could be built like an automobile, with prefabricated sections welded together on assembly lines. He convinced Roosevelt's planners that speed, not elegance, would win the war. By early 1942, Kaiser's crews were clearing tidal mudflats in Richmond, pouring concrete day and night to create 4 massive shipyards. From the air they looked like miniature cities, hundreds of cranes, warehouses, machine shops, hospitals, cafeterias, and dormitories for workers who would arrive by the tens of thousands. Welders replaced riveters, automation replaced craft. The idea was radical: to treat shipbuilding not as an art, but as industrial production on an unimaginable scale. In the months after Midway, Japan built exactly 15 submarines. In the same span, Richmond launched 150 Liberty ships. Every ship was a steel promise that the oceans would belong to America again. Every launch ceremony was a declaration that industrial democracy could outbuild dictatorship. The first completed vessel slid into the bay in just under 2 months, half the time experts thought possible. By late 1943, the average construction time had fallen to 15 days. The record, the SS Robert E. Peary, stunned the world, built, launched, and ready for sea in 4 days and 15 hours. The miracle was not a single ship. It was the system itself, an industrial rhythm that never slept. At night, the glow from the welding arcs could be seen 20 miles away across the bay. Residents of San Francisco joked that you could tell the shift change by looking at the clouds which pulsed with flashes of light from thousands of torches. Journalists who toured the yards described it as a city forged from lightning. To the men and women who worked there, it was something deeper. Many had never seen the ocean before arriving. Some had never used a wrench. They came from Oklahoma farms, from Chicago, factories from southern towns, where opportunity had never reached them. They lived in hastily built trailers and dormitories, shared long cafeteria tables, and worked 12-hour shifts 7 days a week. They were immigrants and housewives, veterans and students, black, white, Latino, and Asian, all learning side by side to build ships faster than the world could sink them. And as their torches flared, the realization spread this was not only a fight for survival, it was proof of what free people could achieve when united by purpose. Across the Pacific, Japanese intelligence analysts could not comprehend the scale of what they were seeing from reconnaissance photographs. New hulls seemed to appear in Richmond overnight. What the Japanese Empire viewed as a temporary surge of American energy was in fact the beginning of an industrial avalanche that would bury them. If Japan's strength was discipline, America's was diversity. If Japan's hope was endurance, America's was invention. The Liberty shipyards of Richmond embodied both a weapon made not of steel alone, but of optimism, improvisation, and speed. Every riveting gun that echoed across the bay was another note in the soundtrack of victory. By the time the sun rose over the Pacific, another hull number had been assigned another keel, laid another ship on its way to carry the war across the ocean. It was here in this small California town that the balance of the Pacific War quietly began to shift. While Tokyo rebuilt its burned carriers, Richmond built a fleet to surround them. The war was no longer decided by admirals on maps, but by ordinary citizens holding welding torches. If you believe that the real power of victory lies not in weapons, but in the hands that built them, type 1 in the comments below. If you disagree, if you think wars are won only by soldiers and generals, tap the like button. Either way, this story will change the way you see what truly broke the Empire of Japan. In the winter of 1941, Richmond, California, was nothing more than a quiet harbor town surrounded by tidal flats and eucalyptus groves. The locals fished for halibut and repaired small boats. Few could imagine that within a year it would become one of the busiest places on Earth, a living machine where men and women worked around the clock to build ships that could carry the weight of a world at war. When Henry Kaiser arrived, he saw what no one else could see, not a sleepy port, but a blank canvas. He walked the muddy shoreline with his engineers and pointed at the horizon. Here, he said, is where we'll build a new city. It sounded like madness. The ground was soft, there were no rail lines, no housing, and no trained shipbuilders. The first challenge was not metal or machinery, it was belief. Kaiser's genius wasn't in ship design, it was in human engineering. He knew how to organize people, how to build systems that multiplied effort instead of wasting it. His plan was simple, but revolutionary: divide each Liberty ship into 250 prefabricated sections that could be built separately and welded together like a puzzle. Instead of craftsmen hammering rivets by hand, teams of welders would join steel plates in hours, not days. For every old rule of shipbuilding, Kaiser found a faster one. In April 1942, bulldozers flattened the marshes. Within weeks, foundations appeared and rail lines snaked toward the bay. Photographs from that spring show what looks like a gold rush of steel men and women in overalls, pouring concrete raising cranes, laying out hull forms that stretched longer than city blocks. By summer, Richmond's first shipyard was ready, complete with its own hospital, police department, post office, and cafeteria, serving 20,000 meals a day. The government had given Kaiser a contract to produce 30 ships that first year. He delivered 140. By the end of 1943, 4 separate yards were operating day and night, producing a ship every 5 days. One observer described it as a symphony played with welding torches. The miracle wasn't only speed, it was inclusion. With millions of men drafted into the military, the shipyards turned to those who had been left out of the industrial world. Housewives became welders, teachers became inspectors, farmers became crane operators. The advertisement said it plainly, if you can hold a torch, you can help win the war. Thousands answered. They came from every corner of America. Trains arrived daily from the South carrying families who had never left their home states. Immigrants who spoke little English learned to read blueprints. African Americans from Louisiana and Texas found for the first time equal pay for equal work. The Richmond Yards became one of the first truly integrated workplaces in America decades before the Civil Rights Movement. Inside the gates, skill didn't matter as much as will. Training centers operated 24 hours a day. Women in denim coveralls learned to weld steel plates under the guidance of patient instructors. A single mistake could mean a leak or a crack, so precision was sacred. Yet the pride was palpable. Workers kept small notebooks to record how many inches of weld they completed in a shift competing not for money, but for speed and perfection. The Liberty Ship program was not just engineering, it was choreography. Every part of the process was timed, measured, and improved. Trains delivered prefabricated sections from inland factories. Cranes lowered engines into place with millimeter precision. As soon as one ship slid into the bay, another keel was laid in the same spot within hours. The sound of steel striking steel echoed day and night, merging with the foghorns and train whistles into a single, relentless rhythm. Kaiser's management style shocked traditional shipbuilders. He walked the yards without ceremony, shaking hands, asking questions, noting suggestions. He treated welders and executives alike as partners. When a foreman complained that a worker had made an error, Kaiser reportedly replied, "Then we improve the system, not the man." That attitude inspired loyalty beyond measure. To many, he was more than a boss. He was the embodiment of a national mission. As production accelerated, so did Richmond itself. The population exploded from $24,000 to over $100,000 in less than 2 years. Trailer parks and barracks sprouted overnight. Schools doubled their enrollment. Cafeterias fed tens of thousands of people each day. Even churches and movie theaters ran around the clock to match the shipyard shifts. The city became a living organism synchronized to one heartbeat, the sound of progress. At night, the glow of the shipyards lit the bay like a sunrise that never ended. From the hills above Berkeley, people could see the sparks raining down from scaffolds like molten stars. The newspapers called it the light that defeats darkness. For the workers, those lights were proof that every sleepless hour meant another convoy reaching the front lines. In Tokyo, Japanese analysts studying American radio broadcasts began to notice strange numbers, hull identifiers, that didn't match any known ship registry. They suspected deception, but reconnaissance photographs confirmed the truth: a single American city was launching ships faster than Japan could count them. One naval officer wrote in his diary, "The Americans build ships as if they grow from the water." By 1943, Richmond was the beating heart of an empire of production. Liberty ships built there carried fuel to the Pacific tanks to North Africa, wheat to starving Europe, and ammunition to every front. They were not glamorous. They were gray, boxy, and slow. But they arrived. They arrived when others sank. The miracle of Richmond wasn't that it built ships. It was that it built unity. Every spark of molten steel carried the hope that a mechanic in a small town could change the course of history. In the echo of hammers and the rhythm of cranes, America found its identity not in conquest, but in creation. If you believe that building together can be more powerful than fighting apart, type 1 in the comments. If you disagree, hit the like button. Either way, keep watching, because what happened next would push Richmond to achieve the impossible. A ship built in less than 5 days, and a legacy that would outlast the war itself. By early 1943, the Richmond shipyards had become a city within a city. 24-hour, lights, endless sirens, and the clang of steel echoing across the bay. But behind the noise was something even more powerful, people who had no reason to believe they could build a warship, yet did it anyway. They called themselves the Yardbirds, a name that sounded almost joking, until you realized what they had accomplished. Many of them had never seen an ocean before coming to California. Men from Arkansas farms who could barely read blueprints. Women from Midwestern towns who had never held a torch. Teenagers who lied about their age just to join the workforce. And yet, in a matter of weeks, they were welding hull plates, operating cranes, and laying keels with the precision of seasoned engineers. They were learning as they built, and the ships they built were learning to save lives. One of them was a young woman named Eleanor Otto, who arrived at Richmond at the age of 21. She had grown up during the Great Depression working odd jobs for pennies. When she heard that shipyards were hiring women, she borrowed money for a train ticket west. Her first assignment was riveting panels on a Liberty ship. The work was hot, heavy, and loud, but she remembered the feeling of watching a ship she helped build slide into the bay for the first time. It was, she later said, like seeing a child take its first steps. She would keep working in aircraft and shipbuilding for the next 70 years, earning the title Rosie the Riveter in flesh and blood. She wasn't alone. In the yards, thousands of women like her wore denim coveralls and bandanas, their faces smudged with soot and sweat. They took over jobs that had been exclusively male, proving they could match any man in endurance and skill. For many, it was the first time they had earned their own paycheck, the first time their hands, not their husbands, defined their worth. Among them were African American workers who faced discrimination outside the shipyard, but found opportunity within it. Henry Kaiser's hiring policy was simple: if you can weld, you can work. Black welders, mechanics, and foremen became a common sight, often training white recruits who arrived later. For many families, it was the beginning of a new life. The shipyards became a social experiment that America hadn't planned for an early glimpse of what a truly integrated workforce could be. The human miracle wasn't only in who worked, but how they worked. Shift bells divided the day into 3 relentless cycles: dawn, dusk, and midnight. When one crew clocked out, another clocked in. Steam rose from the cafeterias at all hours. Coffee pots never cooled. The rhythm of production replaced the rhythm of ordinary life. Babies were born in the new Kaiser hospitals named after the ships their parents were building. One nurse joked that you could tell the shift change by the number of newborn cries. Each new worker carried a small badge engraved with a number. Those numbers became a kind of language, a quiet badge of pride. People didn't ask, "Where are you from?" They asked, "What yard are you in?" Every badge represented someone who had chosen to believe that their effort mattered, even if they never saw the front lines. On December 12, 1942, something extraordinary happened. The Richmond yards launched their 100th Liberty ship. Reporters gathered, photographers filled the scaffolding, and the entire workforce stopped for a single hour to watch. The ship slid into the bay as a brass band played Anchors Aweigh. A welder named Mary Doyle broke a bottle of champagne against the bow. For a moment no one spoke. They had built a warship in less than 3 weeks, and it was already on its way to carry supplies across the Pacific. The workers cheered not for the ship, but for themselves. Then, in November 1942, the world record was set. The Liberty ship SS Robert E. Peary was completed from keel to launch in just 4 days and 15 hours. It was the purest expression of Kaiser's dream. Every department synchronized, every shift overlapping, every worker moving in perfect coordination. The ship was launched before most people believed it could even be finished. Newspapers around the world ran the headline, "A ship built in less than 5 days." For the Japanese Navy, it was more than a curiosity. It was a nightmare. Intelligence officers in Tokyo calculated the implications. If the United States could build ships this fast, then every submarine, every bomber, every blockade was meaningless. The ocean could not be closed against a nation that could fill it faster than you could sink it. Inside Richmond, that realization wasn't about numbers, it was about pride. Workers hung photographs of the Peary on bulletin boards. They passed around newspaper clippings. They started calling themselves the Miracle Crew. For a brief moment, they forgot the fatigue, the noise, and the heat. They had proven that an ordinary person given the right tools and belief could perform a miracle. But the miracles didn't stop at the waterfront. The shipyards created an entire culture. Night schools taught literacy and math. Child care centers allowed mothers to work. The newly built Kaiser Hospital offered free medical care to employees, the first program of its kind in America. That idea would later evolve into the modern health system known as Kaiser Permanente. Everywhere the sense of purpose was tangible. A teenage messenger delivering blueprints, a cook serving 3,000 meals per shift, a machinist adjusting a faulty gear at 2 a.m. Each person in their own way believed that their work was part of something immense, not just a war, but a statement of what free people could achieve. It was in these shipyards that America's identity began to shift. The nation that had been crippled by the Great Depression now saw itself as a place where anyone could contribute, where the value of labor was measured not by prestige, but by necessity. The workers of Richmond weren't building ships anymore, they were building the future. By the end of 1943, more than 90,000 people worked in the Richmond yards. Production records fell almost weekly, and each time a new ship launched, the loudspeakers played, "God Bless America." Welders stopped for a moment, resting their torches, watching as the gray hull slid into the glittering water. Then the whistles blew again, and they went back to work. Those people, welders, riveters, mechanics, clerks, nurses, were the real miracle of Richmond. They didn't fight in the jungles of the Pacific or the deserts of North Africa, but their fingerprints were on every ton of steel that carried freedom forward. If you believe those unsung workers were the true heroes of World War II Type 1 in the comments. If you think victory belongs only to the soldiers who fought overseas, tap the like button. Either way, remember their names, because without them, no fleet could have sailed and no victory would have been possible. By the summer of 1943, the war had entered its most mathematical phase. Victories were now measured not in miles of territory, but in tons of steel, gallons of fuel, and cubic feet of cargo space. In Tokyo, naval planners stared at charts showing merchant losses that looked like open wounds. Each red line marked another convoy sunk by American submarines. Each blue line, representing Japan's replacement rate, was dropping closer to zero. Meanwhile, 6,000 miles away, the cranes of Richmond swung across the bay like metronomes, moving in a rhythm so steady that it felt inevitable. The numbers coming out of California didn't just break records, they broke logic. By late 1943, the United States had built over 1,000 Liberty ships. More than one-third of them came from the 4 Kaiser yards in Richmond. Each ship was 441 feet long, weighed over 10,000 tons, and could carry 9,000 tons of cargo, enough to feed an Army division for a month. The cost about $1.8 million per ship, less than a tenth of what Japan spent on a single destroyer. Japan's total shipbuilding capacity at the time could produce around 200,000 tons of shipping per year. The Richmond yards alone produced 5 times that amount every 6 months. In the Pacific theater, Japan lost merchant ships faster than it could replace them. In January 1942, Japanese losses averaged 15 ships per month. By August, they were losing 40. By the end of 1943, that number had risen to 75, and the graph never stopped climbing. For every ship Japan lost, America launched 3. For every Japanese sailor who died at sea, 20 American civilians in hard hats and coveralls were working to send another ship to replace him. The balance of power had shifted not on the battlefield, but in the factories. Every Liberty ship was a symbol of this imbalance. They were not sleek nor beautiful. Sailors called them ugly ducklings. But to the convoys crossing the Pacific, they were lifelines. Their diesel engines burned cheap fuel. Their hulls were simple and strong. When one was torpedoed and sank, another would take its place within weeks. They were not immortal, they were replaceable. And that in war was far more dangerous. The secret lay in the system. The Richmond yards operated with near-perfect coordination. Steel plates arrived by train from inland mills in Pittsburgh and Chicago, already cut to size. Prefabricated sections were welded on site by small teams, each responsible for one part of the hull bow stern decks or bulkheads. Once the sections were complete, cranes lifted them into place like puzzle pieces. The process was so refined that a ship could go from keel laying to launch in under 2 weeks. The statistics staggered even American commanders. By 1944, Kaiser's shipyards alone employed over 90,000 workers, consumed 30 million feet of welding wire per month, and used enough steel annually to build 1,500 locomotives. A single Liberty ship required 7,000 tons of steel, 50,000 feet of piping, and 40 miles of electrical wiring. At the height of production, one ship left Richmond every 4.5 days, a rate that no empire, no matter how disciplined, could ever match. The Japanese tried to calculate what this meant. In a War College report discovered after the surrender, an analyst wrote, "The enemy's ability to reproduce what we destroy exceeds all understanding. We sink one vessel, 10 more appear." They had no concept of what a fully mobilized industrial democracy could do. American efficiency was not just about machinery, it was about the logistics of belief. Every factory, every railroad, every foundry fed into the system like veins into a heart. Across the continent, workers at Bethlehem Steel Ford and General Motors produced components that flowed westward. A Liberty ship built in Richmond contained parts stamped with the names of 20 states. It was, in essence, a floating map of America. Each launch ceremony became a small act of defiance against despair. Bands played, workers cheered, and families crowded along the waterfront to watch. Children waved flags as the ship slid down the greased wooden ways into the bay, their gray hulls catching the sunlight. The announcer would read the ship's name aloud, followed by its destination, carrying ammunition to the South Pacific or supplies to the Philippines. Every splash was another message to the world: we can outbuild death itself. To understand what this meant strategically, imagine a scale. On one side, Japan, an island nation with limited steel, oil, and manpower. On the other, the United States, a continent-sized factory powered by coal electricity and an army of workers who never stopped. For every Japanese aircraft carrier built after 1942, the United States built 5. For every ton of oil Japan produced domestically, America produced 100. The ratio was so extreme that Admiral Yamamoto's famous warning, "We can run wild for 6 months, but after that, I have no expectation of success," proved hauntingly accurate. By mid-1944, American shipyards had turned industrial arithmetic into a weapon. Logistics officers no longer planned invasions around what was possible, but around what could be produced. Need 200 ships for a landing in the Philippines? They would be ready. Need floating dry docks in the middle of the Pacific? They would be towed there. The system could generate miracles on demand. Back in Richmond, the rhythm of work continued. 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week. Sparks showered from scaffolds like rain. The smell of oil and steel filled the air. At night, the lights of the yards reflected on the water, forming a halo that could be seen miles away. The workers didn't think of themselves as strategists, but that's exactly what they were. Every weld, every rivet, every hour of labor was a move in a global chess game they were winning. Numbers don't often inspire emotion, but these numbers did. They told a story of scale so vast that it became moral proof that a free nation, when threatened, could transform ordinary citizens into an industrial army. In 1945, when the war finally ended, American shipyards had produced 2,710 Liberty ships, totaling more than 27 million tons of cargo capacity. Japan, by contrast, had built fewer than 500 significant naval vessels in the same time. The equation was absolute production equals power. If you believe wars are won not just by courage but by calculation, by those who can build faster than the enemy, can destroy Type 1 in the comments. If you think courage alone decides victory, hit the like button. Either way, remember this. While admirals argued over strategy, it was the math of Richmond that broke the empire of Japan. Every miracle has a price. By late 1943, the Richmond shipyards had become the engine room of victory, a living machine that never stopped turning. But for the people who kept it running, the pace came at a cost few outside the gates could imagine. Behind every triumphant launch photo, there were workers sleeping in their cars, mothers with burned hands, and foremen who hadn't seen daylight in weeks. The war demanded ships, and the shipyards obeyed. The shifts never ended. Days blurred into nights, and nights into days. Steam rose from the welding bays like fog. The heat was relentless, the noise deafening. Men and women worked shoulder to shoulder in temperatures that could exceed 100 degrees. Sparks burned through sleeves and gloves. Accidents were frequent. The official reports used the word incidents, a polite disguise for crushed fingers, broken limbs, and burns that scarred for life. The pressure to keep building was enormous. A single missed deadline could delay a convoy and cost hundreds of soldiers their lives. That knowledge drove workers beyond exhaustion. They pushed through sickness, hunger, and fear because they believed every weld, every beam, every minute mattered. If we stop, one supervisor said, somebody dies out there. It was the kind of motivation that could build miracles and break people. The Kaiser yards recorded thousands of injuries in 1943 alone. Fatigue was the hidden killer. Welders nodded off standing up. Crane operators worked until their vision blurred. Nurses at the yard hospital joked grimly that they could tell the shift schedule by the number of patients who arrived every hour. In December 1943, a boiler explosion in Yard 3 killed 11 workers and injured dozens more. The fire burned for 2 hours. When it was finally out, the crew returned to work the next morning. The ship had to sail. One survivor later said, Henry Kaiser understood something that few industrialists of his time did. Machines could be replaced, but workers could not. When the government refused to fund better medical facilities, he built them himself. He ordered the construction of the Permanente Health Plan, a network of hospitals and clinics dedicated to the shipyard employees and their families. For a small monthly fee, workers received full medical coverage, doctor visit, surgery, even maternity care. It was the first large-scale prepaid healthcare system in American history. Doctors came from all over the country to see how it worked. Nurses rotated through shifts, just like the welders, available 24 hours a day. If someone collapsed from exhaustion or injury, an ambulance arrived in minutes. The plan saved lives and quietly changed the future of medicine. What began as an emergency wartime measure would evolve decades later into Kaiser Permanente, one of the largest healthcare systems in the United States. But even the best hospitals couldn't treat everything. The psychological toll was harder to measure. Families lived in crowded trailers and converted barracks. Privacy was a luxury. Mothers left their children in 24-hour daycare centers run by volunteers. Husbands and wives often worked opposite shifts, passing each other at dawn like strangers. Letters to relatives overseas were written in haste, sometimes on the backs of payroll slips. The entire city moved to the rhythm of war, fast, efficient, and lonely. For many, the only peace came during the launches. When a new ship was ready, the sirens wailed and the workers gathered along the ways. The speeches were short, the bands played. Someone, often a mother, wife, or sister of a soldier, smashed a bottle of champagne against the bow. As the hull slid into the water, thousands of people cheered, then fell silent. In that moment, the fatigue, the burns, the grief, all of it disappeared. They were no longer just workers. They were part of something greater than themselves. Still, the strain left marks that never faded. After the war, many of those workers carried scars both visible and invisible. Their hearing was gone from the endless clatter of metal. Their lungs were scarred from fumes. Some never recovered from the exhaustion. Yet when asked if it had been worth it, most gave the same answer, yes. We were tired, one welder recalled, but we knew why. Kaiser himself refused to let the exhaustion define the story. He often visited the yards at night, moving quietly among the workers, shaking hands, listening. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a believer. He believed that America could win not by destroying, but by building and by taking care of those who built. His health plan was proof that compassion could coexist with production. His shipyards showed that progress didn't have to strip away humanity. It's easy to look back and see only the numbers: 747 ships, 90,000 workers, millions of tons of steel. But the true miracle of Richmond was the moral one, that in the midst of total war, the people who forged weapons of victory also forged a new idea of justice and care. They proved that even when survival was at stake, empathy could still guide industry. When the explosions stopped and the war finally ended, many of those same workers would find themselves out of a job. The shipyards fell silent, the cranes frozen in place, but the hospitals remained open. The idea of health care for all born from exhaustion and necessity survived. In a way, it became Richmond's most enduring ship, a vessel that still carries millions of people today. If you believe that true victory isn't measured only in ships or steel, but in the compassion that keeps people alive to build them, type 1 in the comments. If you disagree, if you think war leaves no room for humanity, hit the like button. Either way, remember, this every spark that flew across the Richmond night carried not just heat, but hope, proof that even in a world at war, mercy could be welded into the machinery of victory. In August 1945, when Japan finally surrendered, the shipyards of Richmond fell silent for the first time in 4 years. The whistles that had marked every dawn and midnight shift stopped blowing. The torches were extinguished. The cranes stood motionless against the gray morning sky, and for a moment the air felt too quiet, as if the city itself were holding its breath. The war that had built Richmond had also ended it. The workers who had once poured through the gates by the tens of thousands now gathered at the waterfront, watching the tide lap against the hulls of half-finished ships. For years their lives had followed the rhythm of construction: 12-hour shifts, glowing nights, the endless clang of steel. Now the silence felt unreal. "We didn't know what to do with our hands," one welder said later. For so long they'd been busy saving the world. Within weeks, production contracts were canceled. The government no longer needed Liberty ships. The seas were full of them. One by one, the 4 Kaiser shipyards shut down. Thousands of workers packed their belongings into trucks and trains, heading back to Oklahoma, Texas, and the Midwest. Others stayed unsure of what came next. The streets that had been crowded with workers and supply trucks emptied overnight. Cafeterias closed. Dormitories were abandoned. The city that had burned with fire and purpose was suddenly just a place again. For many, the return to normal life proved harder than the war itself. The adrenaline that had carried them through years of exhaustion was gone. Men who had supervised hundreds of workers now found themselves unemployed. Women who had discovered independence in the shipyards were told to return to their kitchens. The wartime unity that had broken social barriers gave way to the quiet segregation of peacetime. And yet something profound had changed a belief that those years of sweat and sacrifice had built more than ships. In Richmond, that belief took shape in unexpected ways. The housing built for shipyard families became permanent neighborhoods. The hospitals Henry Kaiser had created for his workers continued to serve the community. Veterans returned to study under the GI Bill, attending classes in repurposed shipyard offices. The skills learned at the welding bays, precision discipline problem-solving, became the backbone of a new industrial America. Sociologists later called it the birth of the American middle class. But to those who lived it, it was simpler. They had gone to war with their hands and returned with dignity. They could buy homes, send children to college, and live with the quiet pride of having built something that mattered. The Yardbirds of Richmond didn't see themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as proof that ordinary people given purpose and trust could achieve the impossible. One of them, a machinist named Joe Ramirez, remembered the first time he walked into the empty yard after the closure. The cranes were still. The giant hulls that once dominated the shoreline were rusting skeletons. But he said he didn't feel sadness. "We built enough ships to end a war," he told a reporter. "Now maybe we can build peace." His words captured what many felt but couldn't say. The same hands that had built warships would now build homes, bridges, and schools. Henry Kaiser understood this better than anyone. After the war, he shifted his empire from steel to healthcare, housing, and education. His company built road cement plants and automobile factories. But his greatest legacy wasn't measured in concrete or profit. It was in people, the workers who carried the spirit of Richmond into every corner of post-war America. The efficiency of the shipyards became the template for modern manufacturing, from Detroit's car plants to Boeing's aircraft lines. In the 1950s, when visitors toured the new Rosie the Riveter National Park, built on the site of the old Shipyard No. 3, they found artifacts of the past: welding masks, lunch pails, photographs of women with torches, and men in soot-covered uniforms. But what struck them most were the faces. The smiles weren't of victory or triumph, but of belonging. Those faces told a story of a country that had once united behind an idea that freedom wasn't given, it was built. For the women who had filled the factories, the war had been a revelation. They had proven their strength in the most literal sense, carrying steel-shaping engines and working alongside men as equals. When peace returned, many were asked to leave their jobs, but they never forgot what it felt like to be part of something so immense. They passed that pride to their daughters, planting the seeds of the women's movement decades later. "We built ships," one former welder said, "and we built ourselves." The African-American workers who had come from the segregated South found that California had changed them too. They had lived in integrated neighborhoods, worked in diverse teams, and earned the same pay as their white co-workers. When they returned home, they carried with them a sense of equality that could no longer be denied. The civil rights movement would draw strength from those very workers who had tasted fairness in the shipyards of Richmond. Even today you can walk along the quiet waterfront where the Liberty ships once stood. The slipways are gone, replaced by warehouses and parks, but the ghosts remain: the echoes of hammers, the hum of generators, the laughter of workers breaking for coffee at dawn. The air smells of salt and rust, and if you close your eyes, you can almost hear the siren that once called 100,000 people to build the future. The story of Richmond didn't end with the war. It became a blueprint for what America could be in peace, a place where people of every background could work side by side, united by purpose instead of fear. The shipyards taught the country that equality wasn't charity and unity wasn't weakness. They taught that greatness wasn't inherited. It was welded together, one joint, one plate, one heart at a time. If you believe that the hands that build peace are as noble as the hands that fight for it, type 1 in the comments. If you think the work of war ends when the guns fall silent, hit the like button. Either way, remember this: when the builders came home, they didn't just return to life, they created a new one, shaping the America that still sails on their legacy. In every war, there are places where nations are destroyed and others where they are reborn. Richmond, California, was one of the latter. The shipyards that once roared with fire and noise have long since fallen quiet, their cranes dismantled their docks, reclaimed by weeds and gulls. But the legacy they forged didn't rust with the steel. It endured not as a monument of machinery, but as proof of what people can do when they build together. After the war, Liberty ships carried food instead of ammunition, refugees instead of soldiers. Some were converted into hospital ships, others into floating schools or cargo liners. Many eventually sank or were scrapped, but their story didn't end there. Every bolt, every weld, every ton of steel was part of a greater inheritance, the idea that ordinary citizens united by purpose could outbuild despair itself. Today, when the wind moves across San Francisco Bay, it passes over the last surviving dried docks and the Rosie the Riveter monument that stands on the old shipyard number 3. Visitors walk through the museum and see photographs of men and women smiling beneath their welding helmets, unaware that history was looking over their shoulders. The exhibits tell of the ships, but what they really celebrate is something more: human endurance, dignity, and the quiet courage of creation. Standing there, it's easy to forget that these were not engineers or soldiers. They were grocery clerks, farmers, janitors, teachers, people who believed that their small labor could change the course of the world. And they were right. The war was not won solely in the skies above Midway or the beaches of Normandy. It was won in the flame-lit nights of Richmond, in every hand that reached for a wrench instead of a rifle. Henry Kaiser once said, "If you can dream it, you can build it." That belief reshaped an entire nation. His methods became the foundation of modern industry. His health plan became a model for American healthcare. His workers, men and women of every color and creed, became symbols of the unity that war had demanded and peace would soon forget. But the truest legacy of Richmond isn't in the systems it created or the records it broke. It's in the light. The same light that once flared from 1,000 welding torches still glows in the idea that human progress depends not on destruction, but on construction. It's the light of faith, not religious but civic, that says progress belongs to all who dare to build it. For every nation, there comes a time when survival depends not on soldiers, but on the strength of its people's hands. In 1942, America learned that lesson in steel and fire. In 2025, it remains just as true. Technology may have replaced torches with robots and shipyards with software, but the heart of progress is unchanged. It still beats in teamwork and invention, in the willingness to create when it would be easier to destroy. Richmond's skyline no longer glows orange at midnight, but its story lives in every bridge, every hospital, every factory, where people still build something greater than themselves. The war ended 80 years ago, but the philosophy that won it, that freedom and unity can turn effort into power, remains timeless. Before the credits roll, imagine for a moment those workers back in 1943, the hiss of steam, the rhythm of hammers, the sparks falling like stars. They didn't know that history would remember them. They only knew that the ship had to sail. And in that unshakable belief in the simple act of showing up and building one more, they left behind a lesson stronger than steel. If you believe that creation is humanity's greatest weapon, type 1 in the comments. If you think victory belongs only to those who fight, hit the like button. And if you want to keep hearing the untold stories of how ordinary people changed the world, subscribe to this channel, because the next story, like this one, begins with light courage and the hands that built peace out of war.